So this article talks about a children's hospital that wants to increase two things. One, their screening rate of adolescents to see just the ones that they actually somehow check in with and see if they're using tobacco. And the second thing they want to increase is the percent of adolescents who report tobacco use. Now, that second thing sounds kind of strange. They want to increase the percent of children that they're finding using smoking cigarettes. That's not quite true. The issue is that right now, about 5% of the ones they're screening are showing up as smoking, whereas they know that the state average is about 35% for Alabama. And so they're assuming, probably correctly so, that a lot of the adolescents are somehow lying. And so they're trying to get closer to that truth so that they could provide helpful information that could ideally maybe help these youth make more informed decisions about smoking. So that's the basis of the article. It looked like it was about three years long, 33 months. Let's skip down to the first control chart. So again, there were two things they were looking at. One is they were trying to increase the percent of adolescents that came into their hospital that were screened for smoking use, in other words, to the percent that they had the chance of identifying cigarette use, and then they also wanted to increase the actual percent of reported use. In other words, understanding somehow how to get more honest answers on those in that screening process. So this first control chart, notice that their overall conclusion of the study is the percent of adolescents screened and percent of adolescents reporting tobacco use was unchanged throughout the study period. In the language of control charts, what they're saying is all of the variation we saw in our control charts was common cause variation. This up and down is just typical random variation. It wasn't an indication of this interventions that they used. I think they used maybe 4 interventions, that those interventions actually helped or hurt. That appeared not to be the case because we didn't really have any special cause variation here. Now, just if we would have had like some single special cause variation, let's say that this point had been slightly above, so it would have been above the upper control limit, that doesn't automatically trigger that something is definitely happening, but it would at least be grounds for looking into the matter a little more. And they really didn't even have anything that triggered any red flags that anything was changing. Now, that's their reported result. I actually have, I think they used the control chart a little incorrectly here. Let me just go to this Pareto chart here first, and then I'll talk about what little mistake I think they made. So on this Pareto chart, they're looking at the different hospital units. They have 15 different units, and they really are trying to cut down on this these cases where someone doesn't get screened for whatever reason, the incomplete missing data. Essentially, they're trying to cut down on missing data. And so they've created a Pareto chart. In other words, they figured out how much missing data there were in each of the 15 units, and then they arranged them in order of height. So this first unit here had 1/3 of all of the missing data was somehow coming from that unit 1. And they make this statement: 2 of the 15 units accounted for approximately 50% of the incomplete tobacco unit. What they're saying here is that cumulative rate, 49.6, in other words, they're adding this bar to this bar. If you add that, that's roughly half of the incomplete data cases that they had were coming from either Unit 1 or Unit 2. So remember that these numbers are just adding up the total of all the bars to the left of it. So by this point, by the time we look at the first 6 units, we have 80.5% of the missing data accounted for. And then instead of just making this tail run off, these are units where they really weren't getting much missing data anyway, so they just combined them all together. That's why it kind of goes out of sync of that typical Pareto decreasing order. It was just because they combined these, basically saying these were not an issue at all. So this is helpful from the hospital perspective, assuming they have the ability to target certain units with more education, more materials. Certainly units 1 and 2 there are going to be ones to focus on, because that's half of all the missing data. So let me show you why I have some issues with how they did their control chart. So they had 33 months of data collection, and that included 12 months of baseline and then 21 months of interventions. In other words, their first year, they're really just collecting data to see what their current rates were, and then they were doing almost 2 years of interventions to see if they could increase those rates. And it says that they're 90.1% that baseline data, those first 12 months, determined the baseline data for the control chart. It says that a couple other places also, but that doesn't appear to be what they did. So what they should have done, they're saying that this first year up until January 17 or February 17, until one of these dates, they froze it right there and then calculated the average of these points here and created the upper and lower control limit based on that first year of data points. But that's clearly not the case. I mean, if we look at these, the average of these right here, even though we don't have the exact numbers, every single one is above that. What they're saying was the average for the first year, their baseline average. Even if they did include this January 17, that's nowhere near enough to knock out the impact of all these on the average. So their average really should have been somewhere up here, 91, maybe even close to 92%, based on that baseline. And they should have created the entire control chart based on that. So you would have seen the blue line up here. Certainly the upper and lower control limits would also be raised. Then what would have happened, these data points would all be the same. So the blue points themselves are data points. Let me show you. So here's the guide that we had in our reading section, and this is what they should have done. They should have taken the first set of points and taken the average, standard deviation, like we did in the focus test this week, and created these stable, these frozen control limits. And then once they started the intervention, so that next 21 months, they should have plotted according to that same one. And what would have happened if we look back at the article, so if that light blue line was up here somewhere, then what they would have found is right here, they would have actually had at least 8 in a row below that center line, below that average, which would have actually said that it would have been evidence that the percent screen had dropped after they started the interventions. And really this would be something for them to it'd be good for them to be aware of, because what may have happened, and I read the rest of the article, it looked like there wasn't complete buy-in among the nursing staff, and it could have been actually counterproductive, or there could have been other reasons. Maybe it was just random variation, but as soon as you move that blue line up and these red lines up based on what the baseline is, I think this would have been out of control also. Video mandatory orientation, so that whole word mandatory might have caused issues too. So all that to say that I think they made a little mistake there in how they set up and used their control. So not only was it ineffective, but it appears that it was negatively effective. Now let me talk just a little bit about this common cause variation. So if you were not using control charts, let's say you had identified this problem in general, and then you started maybe this focus group, the nursing education, and then you saw these rates increase for the next 2 months. I mean, it's very tempting that you might start thinking, oh, okay, we had this nursing education and the rates have increased for the last 2 months. You might publish that, like, this time it was 89%, but the average of the last 2 months has been 91%. It'd be easy to publish that as in your local literature as a success, when in reality, when you look at the big picture, that's not the case at all. And that's the point of control chart. It helps us from these little jumps that we make. Here's an even bigger one on the percent of adolescents who are reporting use. So they added this e-cig screening question, and for the next 3 months, the percent of reported use went up. Had you not been using a control chart, it would have been very tempting to see this steady climb over the course of 3 months and think, wow, this was a really impactful thing to do. And plus, we had used this educational video, like the combo. Now we're seeing these skyrocketing rates, and that's what you publicize to the media, to the board, whatever it may be. And then the next month's results come out. And a little hope, and this common cause variation is so up and down just by randomness alone, and that's why we can't go month to month. That's why we want to look at the big picture here. Just want to point out one thing here too in the limitation. It says nursing units were facing several competing priorities, including other QI projects. I think here is where you're starting to get some hints that there may have been some resistance, and reasonably so. I think one of the dangers in data overload or data collection overload, it really creates a burden on who the data is being collected on. We see this in K-12 with standardized testing. It's kind of swung back from what it had been a decade ago, but at one point students were taking so many tests in order to collect this data on their performance that it was really starting to have negative impacts overall. I think that's something you want to keep in mind as you consider quality improvement projects, not just doing it for the sake of doing it, especially if it does create a burden on whatever nursing staff or patients or administrators or whatever that may be. So balance out the potential reward from the QI study, like I think they found in the nutrition study that most of this week's quiz questions are about. And in this case, it looked like it may have actually been more of a burden than it was worth.